nominated my thesis for this award, and for everyone that had helped me through the process with that. Betsy, Carrie, Rob, Melanie, Lauren, my family and friends, and those that helped support me, my fellow thesis writers, that I collaborated early on with to flesh out the beginning of my topic. So how did I get here? How did I start my process with this? It all started in Betsy's cultural landscape theory class. A core theory of that class that I kept coming back to was Edward Ralph's take on sense of place. Ralph described it as the fundamental aspect of everyday life and a connection between a person and their place in the world. The final paper for Betsy's class had me thinking about downtown Annapolis and examining the spatial relationships and the relationships with people that the landscape has. One of the most important parts of examining downtown Annapolis was the relationship with the water, its views, and how the effects of climate change are altering that landscape. Annapolis had me thinking what other cultural landscapes are around that I could look at. I then took the idea of relationships with the water, expanded my thinking, and just really went with the whole Chesapeake Bay idea. My thesis follows that and what I had found during the assignment. Specifically, I decided to explore the relationship of the landscape and the sense of place that historic or cultural communities who are attached to the coastal or island locations they live. Many of these communities have already begun to feel and see the effects of climate change as it alters the places that they deem important. In my exploration, I found that not enough is being done to allow for those communities to pick and choose what pieces of their culture and heritage they want to preserve. So in changing current practices, I suggested that community-based preservation frameworks should be created or adapted from current preservation practices. The frameworks that I suggest in my thesis, I hope will be an important component of moving our field towards a future where the impermanence of land will not mean a community's culture and heritage will cease to be. So why do I feel like my thesis is important to overall preservation? The issue that I realized when researching my topic early on was I saw the sentiments of communities, particularly in cities. I wasn't necessarily looking at the Chesapeake Bay as a whole just yet. So even in cities, the communities and people within those communities reflected on the overall issues of having to move away, preservation not necessarily capturing their heritage and culture. It's more just the buildings that preservation was focused on, not necessarily where they were living, the heritage that goes along with that. So when I did move to the Chesapeake Bay, I found out that there is a larger community which is made up of smaller communities, which are the Chesapeake Bay watermen. And these communities are all separated based upon where they live, the different ports, the different areas that they live. Another issue that I found is that preservationists, while generally doing what they believe is right with input or lack thereof from community members, don't necessarily capture these cultures or heritages that they want to preserve. Yet, community members never really have full control over what they want to preserve with their culture and heritage. Usually it's just partial solutions. With climate change and my treatise, I saw the opportunity to offer a way to change the practice and how we should go about allowing them to preserve their own heritage and culture by allowing them to decide what they fully want. However, that is a challenge that I did not fully answer in my thesis because there is a larger overall quote unquote messiness, which Betsy offered that word originally, um, to all of these solutions because it is just so much and there's so many differing groups that have to go into it. So you heard me mention some terms earlier, such as sense of place and place attachment theory, which is a way to describe the connection between people and the everyday places they interact with. Futures mapping, which also includes nostalgia, which is the consideration of the past, present, and future in a lived, documented timeline. And community-based preservation, which my thesis really drives home the point, which is a form of preservation where the community, new and old members, actively participate and decide on the actions that will be taken for the overall continuation of their culture and heritage. The largest topic that, or idea that really was interwoven throughout my thesis outside of the community-based preservation was sense of place and place attachment theory. And that allows us to describe a community's attachment through nostalgia, as well as setting, which is the landscape, the activities, including those of the workplace, and meetings, which is the community identity and intangible ideas. Using this theory, place attachments should be documented and used to situate agency throughout communities. Therefore, I believe, and my thesis really goes throughout this whole idea, that preservationists have a responsibility to facilitate a community-based framework that aids in the preservation of these communities' culture and heritage. Yet, like I just mentioned, there's that messiness because the varying degrees of attachment that communities have for a particular place through their involvement and concern and the process that's involved during the negotiation of heritage and the recognition of many of these interpretations of meanings, it can get to be so large that it may take multiple agencies to even start situating that agency. And community-based preservation, which I also interwove throughout my thesis. I attached myself to this approach specifically by using my case study of the Chesapeake Bay waterman communities. The landscapes where the waterman communities live and practice their trades are becoming impermanent due to the effects of climate change and sea level rise. Yet, since the watermen live throughout the Chesapeake, and each island or coastal community has a diverse time frame for expected change, and they are separately self-defined, the community-based approach ends up being broken down, yet it's almost like a blanket as well. So that, again, goes back to the overall messiness of it, where even within a said community, there's subsets of communities depending on where you go and look. One of the main issues I found with community-based preservation was that professionals also had a hard time trying to describe the differences between understanding the effects of climate change on communities as a problem to solve and a condition to adapt. Understanding the effects of climate change as a problem has more to do with the ethnography side of preservation that hasn't yet fully been tapped into outside of our program here at Goucher. And feelings and sense of place and how those affect and alter those feelings as well are also part of the understanding that we as preservationists have, but it's not really a topic that's explored outside of here. So as a condition to adapt, it's something that us in the preservation field are already working on, but more so with community input as a minor process rather than a major process, especially if the communities are place attached and want to be in control of certain decisions for their futures. Likewise, I found that there are many other challenges with community-based preservation, as in practical politics for members of communities and for professionals who have been providing solutions. The practical politics, such as getting a majority of community members involved. Once involved, what is and how do these decisions be made? That's another challenge. And what information that the communities actually want to accept is, I would say, one of the biggest issues, especially when you're talking about climate change and sea level rise, because not a lot of them want to believe that the climate is changing. They all write it off as erosion, and something that's been happening for years and years because it's just something that is. And yes, so hit on those points. Missed a slide. So revising our practice, one of the biggest takeaways that I had was that the National Register has a complicated role going into the future with climate change. Questions could be asked if we are a slave to it with our planning. Should we be working to get more places determined eligible to bring them into planning? Can we accept that it represents only part of what is important, or is it time to evaluate what is listed in vulnerable areas and deaccession of some properties? I found that accepting what the National Register is it's only a partial set of resources, and that's the first step in going forward. I also presented that traditional cultural properties can be more than a type of listing in the National Register because TCPs place an important role in community cultural traditions, beliefs, and activities. TCPs create a multi-purpose idea of place that allows traditional practices to blend with ideas such as heritage tourism, and TCPs can also include portions of land that are no longer there. The general idea is that ordinary places need to be thought of as important, especially when you're discussing communities. So utilizing the TCP idea would be beneficial as a blanket to include those resources not covered by the overall National Register. Similarly, preservationists and professionals should begin to place a greater importance on place attachment, as it represents the basis for ways of life that require special attention as places become impermanent. The big three that I have are the setting, activities, and meanings. Some cultures are entrenched in a place and have operated there for decades or longer. So as places become impermanent, it's detrimental that special attention is paid to these places and communities, because the overall 3 points change as the climate changes as well. So the overall heritage and culture could then possibly die off completely. Nope, just double checking. So lastly, I critiqued Maryland's Heritage Area Program, which was or is a larger overall program that encompasses, I think it was 12 different heritage areas throughout Maryland. And this program really focuses on heritage tourism. But I mentioned that they need to be used as a way for community members to engage in shaping the future of their communities, not just for heritage tourism. As part of my thesis, I urged professionals in charge to ask questions to themselves, detailing what parts of heritage and culture of the groups and communities that they are actually trying to preserve. Heritage tourism, again, doesn't cover all of the bases, and relegating a portion of culture or heritage to a museum when it could still be active and alive is counterintuitive to our practice. So as the sea level continues to rise and continues to alter the landscape along with erosion, preservationists need to expand their practice to include the situation of agency within communities that should be overseeing their own futures. The shift from traditional preservation practices to community-based preservation needs to happen to serve as a modality for ensuring the transmissions and conservation of beliefs, values, and overall way of life specific to the intersection of people and place. The greatest lesson that my study has for the communities that are threatened by climate change and sea level rise is that formal and informal or less organized community groups can use one or all or a combination of the frameworks that I offer towards preserving their culture and heritage. The three most recommended frameworks that I had were Melnick et al.'s 7 adaptation responses, and these 7 responses were talking about climate change, and they were offered during one of the National Park Service's seminars back in 2014, and they were revised again in 2016. And these responses are more for single owner management rather than larger communities. So by looking at these responses, trying to transfer them from single owner management to this overall broader and then back again is one of the 3 that I really thought was really good, and showcasing that it can be altered for community-based reasons was one of the biggest things of importance in my thesis. Second, the theoretical traditional cultural property framework that I offered, positioning communities and places as more than a National Register listing, I thought was relatively important, because place as a important role in community cultural traditions, beliefs, activities, and the TCP's overall role with that can create a multi-purpose idea of place that allows traditional practices to blend with ideas such as heritage tourism. Again, TCPs can also include portions of land that are no longer there. The general idea is that ordinary places really need to be thought of as important, especially when you go and talk about communities. And coming from being an outsider, you can't necessarily say that, oh, this place is important over that place. And lastly, the heritage well-being framework, which includes the idea of a historic afterlife, I thought was very perfect for this whole thesis, because it allows future generations to discover and decide what they find important about the landscape. It's not so much about the past generations and what they thought about important. It's moving forward. What do the next generations really find important? Still, the suggested frameworks in my study are open-ended, and how they are utilized will be variable. I recommended that professionals find a willingness to not step in and make decisions because those actions are counterintuitive to the idea of community-based preservation. And overall, there is no reason why communities should revert to a top-down approach where the government or public serving entities decide their fate after agency is situated. Thank you. Yes.
Made me think of Smith Island. That's
Yes.
not in the future.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely not in the future. It's happening as you're talking. Is anybody following your principles or doing anything similar on Smith Island now? Or maybe thinking
It's-
of it?
Yeah, so it's a lot of heritage tourism. Many of the articles that I went over, the Smith Islanders, much like the Tangier Islanders, are very entrenched in their beliefs. And even though preservationists and state officials are trying to work with them and really nail down what they want, nothing really has come about outside of them just saying, "Oh, our island's eroding. Places are going into the ocean. That's how it was with this island and that island 100 years ago." Darius, right next to you, actually knows a lot about this topic because that's his work, and he also helped me very early on with nailing down what I exactly wanted to do with my thesis as well. But in terms of stuff getting done, it's just people talking with each other right now. There's no concrete solutions.
I took over Hugh Miller's role of asking the hard question for most of our presenters. But how could I have a question for Ross when you can, those of you who know us know there's a perfect mind meld over the last year between Ross and I in thinking about a lot of these topics. So I think it's interesting that both Ben and Ross have mentioned the TCP. And, you know, it was just always that thing over there that our anthropologists did with Native American people, and that we're finding this close attachment and inextricable ties between people and place and way of life that the Watermen epitomize. That I can, we are both problematizing it and operationalizing that concept, and I never thought we would be doing either of those. So let's keep TCPs in our mind. So.
Not really a question, but or a statement.
So this is more of a theoretical question for food for thought versus expecting a real answer. So I'm combining both topics that we've heard so far. And the question is do progress and community expansion always have to have a negative impact on placement concerns and attachment with historic preservation?
I would think it's more of a byproduct and an unintentional one at that. Because in terms of preservation, so much of the laws are around built environment. So when you go and try and preserve the culture and heritage of a place, and there's other things happening with the built environment, then if you can't preserve that built environment that people are attached to, then it's almost a negative impact because you're losing that overall heritage and community, unless there's a way to preserve that, of which we don't necessarily have that yet.
All right. Thank you, Ross.